It was a typical late summer afternoon in September 1982 when the dry, golden heat of Auburn, California seemed to hold the world in a state of suspended animation. In this quiet corner of Placer County, the air was usually filled with the scent of sun-baked pine and the rhythmic hum of cicadas. A landscape where residents felt a deep sense of security. They expected nothing more than the routine drift of a suburban Tuesday. But what began as a quiet disappearance in a tree-lined neighborhood would eventually unearth a high-stakes mystery that would change the history of the local sheriff's department forever. Hidden in plain sight for 25 years, a secret was about to be unmasked, one that proved the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who wear a badge and live right next door. Tonight, as you settle in and the world outside grows still, we look into the quiet shadows of the K-9 commander's secret and the silent witness of Rollins Lake. The story of Janet Kovacic begins not with a scream, but with a void. At 27 years old, Janet was the kind of person who defined her life through the care of her 2 young children. She was a woman of habit, of devotion, and of a growing, silent fear that she shared only with those she trusted most. On the morning of September 8th, the sun rose over the Sierra Nevada foothills just as it always did, casting long shadows across the Kovacic driveway. Her husband, Paul Kovacic Jr., was a man of significant stature in the community. As a sergeant and the K-9 commander for the Placer County Sheriff's Office, he was a figure of authority, a man trained to maintain order and command obedience. But inside the walls of their home, that command had taken on a darker, more suffocating tone. Friends and family would later recall that Janet had reached a breaking point. She was a mother who lived for her children, yet she was beginning to realize that the environment she was raising them in had become a recipe for disaster. She had recently started speaking about leaving Paul, a decision that is perhaps the most dangerous moment in the life of anyone living with a volatile partner. To the outside world, Paul was the respected officer with his disciplined German shepherd, but to Janet, he was becoming a source of constant, simmering tension. The air in their home was heavy, thick with the kind of unspoken pressure that makes the floorboards seem to groan under the weight of things left unsaid. At the time, the community saw Paul as a pillar of law and order. He was the man who trained the dogs that caught the criminals, a specialist in the language of force and tracking. However, something had happened in the weeks leading up to Janet's disappearance that served as a chilling omen. The family dog, a German shepherd named Fuzz, had died suddenly. Paul claimed the dog had gotten into some trash and that I had kicked it in a moment of frustration. But those who knew Paul's temper and those who saw the aftermath whispered a different story. They believed Paul had stomped the animal to death in a fit of uncontrollable rage. For Janet, the death of Fuzz wasn't just the loss of a pet. It was a mirror reflecting a terrifying possibility. If a man could do that to a loyal animal, what could he do to a wife who was planning to walk away? On that September morning, Paul left for work, or so the official record would initially state. By the time the sun began to set and the afternoon heat started to fade into a cool evening breeze, Janet was gone. There was no note. There was no packed suitcase. Her car remained in the driveway, and her children were left behind, a fact that everyone who knew Janet said was an absolute impossibility. She was not the kind of mother to walk away from her heartbeat. As the hours turned into days, the silence from the Kovacic house became deafening. Investigators found themselves in an impossible position. They were looking for the wife of one of their own, a man who knew exactly how a crime scene was processed, how evidence was gathered, and how a person could be made to disappear into the vastness of the California wilderness. For years, the case grew cold, covered by the dust of decades. Paul maintained a mask of innocence, suggesting to anyone who would listen that Janet had simply abandoned her family, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood or a desire for a different life. He continued his career, walking the halls of justice while the mystery of his wife's whereabouts remained locked away. But as it turned out, the earth has a way of surrendering its secrets when the waters recede. Rollins Lake, a reservoir nestled in the mountains north of Auburn, began to drop during a period of drought. In 1995, a group of boaters spotted something weathered and white in the silt of the lakebed. It was a partial human skull, smoothed by the movement of water and time. At the time of the discovery, forensic technology was not yet capable of whispering the name of the victim. The skull sat in an evidence locker for another 12 years, a silent witness waiting for science to catch up with its story. It wasn't until 2007 that advanced DNA testing finally provided the answer that the Kovacic family had dreaded for a quarter of a century. The skull belonged to Janet, but the DNA wasn't the only thing the skull revealed. Forensic examiners found a small, precise hole in the bone, a hole consistent with a large caliber gunshot. It was a wound that matched the type of service weapon Paul Kovacic had carried as a sergeant. The discovery shifted the narrative from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation with a singular, terrifying focus. In a move that remains one of the most unique investigative turns in California history, the FBI decided to look back even further, to the very beginning of the darkness. In 2005, they did something few had ever seen in a murder trial. They exhumed the remains of the dog, Fuzz. They weren't just looking for animal remains. They were looking for a pattern. They wanted to see if the bones of the dog showed the same overkill tendencies that were now being attributed to the disappearance of Janet. They believed that the violence visited upon the dog was a precursor, a dress rehearsal for the violence that would eventually claim Janet's life. The investigation into the dog's death was intended to unmask the monster in plain sight, proving that the commander of the K-9 unit had used his strength not to protect, but to destroy. As we stand here in 2026, the echoes of this case are returning. Paul Kovacic, now an old man of 76, is facing his first parole hearing after being convicted in 2009. But the shadows of Rollins Lake are long, and new questions are emerging about the very evidence that put him away. His defense team now points to suppressed FBI emails from years ago, private correspondences that allegedly questioned the forensic analysis of the dog's remains. It is a strange, lingering twist in a story already defined by betrayal. Before we move deeper into the evidence found in the silt and the chilling details of that 1982 morning, I want to take a moment to welcome you back to the quiet. If you are still awake and listening, settling in for the night, I'd love to know where you're joining us from. Whether it's the middle of the night in a bustling city or the quiet hours of a rural town, leave a comment and let us know your time and location. It helps the world feel a little smaller and a little safer as we explore these mysteries together. The story of Janet Kovacic is more than a crime report. It is a journey through the vastness of human memory and the persistence of justice. It is the story of a woman who was left behind by the system meant to protect her, and a husband who thought the silence of the woods and the depth of the lake would keep his secrets forever. But justice, like the rising and falling of the tide at Rollins Lake, has a way of finding its path. As the wind rustles through the pines outside your window, imagine the stillness of that lake bed and the secrets that finally decided to float to the surface. Paul Kovacic was a man who understood the power of the leash. He knew how to break a spirit, whether it was an animal under his command or a woman who shared his bed. In the early 1980s, the culture of law enforcement was often tight-lipped, a brotherhood that protected its own even when the rot was visible. No one heard the door close on the final day Janet was seen alive, and for a long time, no one dared to ask the K-9 commander the questions that mattered. But the possibility of the truth remained, flickering like a distant light across the water. We are here tonight to follow that light, to retrace the steps of an investigation that spanned decades, and to understand how a single weathered bone can speak louder than 25 years of lies. Janet's friends remembered her as a vibrant, vulnerable soul who only wanted safety for her children. When she vanished, a piece of them went with her, leaving a void that could only be filled by the truth. Even now, as Paul fights for his release, the memory of Janet remains, a mother who never would have left her children, a woman whose story was finally told by the very earth that tried to hide her. We will look closely at the forensics, the trial, and the 2026 updates that have brought this cold case back into the light of the modern day. For now, just breathe with the rhythmic pace of the story and let the details unfold gently. Would you like me to move on to the next chapter? In the quiet foothills of Auburn, California, there is a house that once held a family, a career of high standing, and a secret that stayed buried for exactly 25 years. To the neighbors who lived on those winding, oak-shaded roads in the early 80s, the Kovacic family represented the very backbone of the community. Paul was not just a police officer. He was a sergeant, a K-9 commander, a man whose word carried the weight of the law and whose German shepherd, Fuzz, was a symbol of his dedication to order. But behind the closed doors of that house on Edgewood Road, a different story was being written, one of control, of mounting fear, and of a woman who felt the walls closing in around her. Janet Kovacic was 27 years old, a mother whose life revolved around her two young children. She was known for her kindness, her steady presence, and a devotion that made the idea of her simply walking away feel impossible to those who truly knew her. Yet, on a late summer morning in 1982, that is exactly what the world was told happened. If the truth about Janet isn't uncovered, a decorated sergeant remains a local hero, his reputation untarnished by the whispers of the few who saw the cracks in his armor. Without the truth, a mother's disappearance is written off as a voluntary abandonment, a narrative that Paul Kovacic maintained with a chilling, professional composure for over 2 decades. The air in Auburn during the month of September is often heavy with the scent of dry grass and the distant, dusty smell of the Sierras. It is a place where the silence of the woods can feel protective. But as the years turned into decades, that same silence became a weight. For 25 years, the question of what happened to Janet lingered like a low-lying mist. The investigation seemed to stall against the blue wall of the very department Paul served. But nature has a way of refusing to keep secrets forever. Why did a K-9 commander's dog have to be exhumed by the FBI to solve a human murder? It is one of the most haunting open loops in California's criminal history. Long before Janet vanished, there was Fuzz, the loyal K-9 who died under circumstances that left Janet terrified. She told her friends that the dog hadn't just died. He had been a victim of the same rage she feared would eventually turn on her. It would take 23 years for investigators to realize that the dog's grave held the first chapter of Janet's end. And then there is Rollins Lake. In 1995, the waters receded, pulling back a blue veil to reveal the dry, cracked silt of the lakebed. What the receding waters revealed that year was a weathered fragment of a human skull, a silent witness that sat in an evidence locker for another 12 years before DNA technology could finally give it a name. Tonight, we look into the shadows of the foothills to understand how a hole in a piece of bone, no larger than a coin, matched the service weapon of a man sworn to protect. As you settle in, let the rhythm of the rain against the window ground you. We are going back to 1982, to the day the music stopped on Edgewood Road, and the long, slow exhumation of a truth that many hoped would stay buried forever. As we begin this journey into the foothills, I want to welcome you back. If you are still awake and listening, perhaps find a more comfortable position as we settle into the first case of the evening. It helps the channel grow when you let me know where you're listening from tonight. Whether it's a quiet room in a busy city or a house tucked away in the woods, much like the one in Auburn. Take a deep breath and let's look at the vanishing on Edgewood Road. September 8th, 1982, in Auburn, California, began with the kind of unremarkable clarity that usually defines a transition into autumn. The air in Placer County was beginning to lose its summer bite, and for 27-year-old Janet Kovacic, the morning was supposed to be a series of simple, rhythmic tasks. She was a mother whose world was anchored by her 2 young children, a woman whose daily life was a map of school runs, grocery lists, and the quiet maintenance of a suburban home on Edgewood Road. But as the sun climbed higher over the Sierra Nevada foothills, that map began to dissolve. By the afternoon, the house on Edgewood Road had fallen into a state of frozen animation. Janet's car remained parked in the driveway, a silent witness to a departure that left no tracks. Inside the house, her purse sat on the counter, untouched, containing her keys, her identification, and the money she would have needed for the day's errands. To those who knew her, this was the first and loudest alarm bell. Janet was not a woman who drifted. She was a woman who stayed. She lived for the small, messy moments of motherhood, and the idea that she would simply walk out the door and leave her children waiting was a scenario that found no purchase in reality. The neighborhood was silent, the kind of silence that only exists when the person who usually fills a home with life is suddenly, inexplicably, gone. It is a heavy, ringing quiet that neighbors later described as a sense of stagnation, a feeling that the very air around the Kovacic property had become thick and difficult to breathe. Standing at the center of this gathering storm was Janet's husband, Paul Kovacic Jr. At 34 years old, Paul was a figure of significant gravity in Auburn. He wasn't just a police officer. He was a sergeant and the K-9 commander for the Placer County Sheriff's Office. In a town like Auburn in the early 80s, being a law enforcement family carried a specific kind of social currency. It meant you were protected, respected, and part of a brotherhood that closed ranks at the first sign of trouble. Paul was a man who commanded dogs and men with the same rigid, unyielding authority. He was the protector of the peace, the man people called when the world went wrong. When the report of Janet's disappearance first reached the department, the reaction was filtered through the lens of this professional brotherhood. There is a specific kind of two-tier system of justice that often develops in small-town departments, and from the very first hour, the investigation into Janet's whereabouts was colored by Paul's badge. While her family insisted that she would never abandon her children, the narrative being whispered through the halls of the sheriff's office began to lean toward the label of a voluntary missing person. They suggested she was unhappy, perhaps overwhelmed, and had simply chosen to start over. It was a label that felt like a betrayal to those who loved her, a way of silencing the victim before the search had even truly begun. Paul's alibi for that morning was, on the surface, ironclad. He was at work, surrounded by fellow deputies, performing his duties as the K-9 commander. He was in the public eye, logged into the system, and accounted for by the very people trained to observe and report. It was the perfect alibi, or perhaps the perfect shield. The alibi loop created a situation where questioning Paul felt like questioning the integrity of the entire Placer County Sheriff's Office. To suspect the commander was to suspect the core of the community's safety. Friends and family would later recount that beneath the surface of this respected law enforcement family, a darker reality had been taking shape. Janet had grown terrified of the man who wore the badge. She had confided in those closest to her that she was planning to leave, that the domestic life on Edgewood Road had become a cage maintained by Paul's volatile temper. But in 1982, the law enforcement family brand was a powerful deterrent to the truth. As the first few days turned into weeks, the investigation into Janet's disappearance didn't so much progress as it curdled. The leads were thin, the searches were localized, and the shadow of Paul's position seemed to muffle the urgency that usually accompanies the vanishing of a young mother. Investigators found themselves walking a tightrope between professional courtesy and the mounting evidence that something was deeply wrong inside that house. But to understand why Janet might have vanished, we have to look at the violence that occurred in that house just weeks before she disappeared. Violence directed at a member of the family who couldn't speak. It was an event that many believe was a grim rehearsal for what was to come. A moment where the K-9 commander revealed a side of himself that no badge could justify. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2, detailing the suspicious death of the family dog, Fuzz, and how that event became the catalyst for Janet's final attempt to escape? Chapter 2, The Death of Fuzz. To understand the fear that took root in the Kovacic home, one has to look at a member of the household who had no voice to cry for help. His name was Fuzz. He was a German shepherd, a breed known for its loyalty and intelligence. And in the home of a Placer County K-9 commander, you might imagine Fuzz lived a life of disciplined companionship. Paul Kovacic Jr. wasn't just a police officer. He was a specialist in the bond between man and dog. He understood the psychology of the pack. He knew exactly how much pressure it took to command obedience, and he knew the precise line between discipline and cruelty. At least that was his professional reputation. But the domestic reality of the Kovacic household was beginning to fray at the edges, and Fuzz would become the silent witness to a burgeoning darkness. It was a typical afternoon when a mundane event triggered a shift in the atmosphere that Janet would never forget. Fuzz, acting on a simple animal instinct, had gotten into the kitchen trash. To most families, this is a minor frustration, a mess of coffee grounds and crumpled paper to be swept up with a scolding. But for Paul, it was an affront to his authority. According to those who knew the family at the time, his reaction wasn't one of a professional handler. It was a fit of pure, unadulterated rage. The official story Paul would later tell was that he had simply kicked the dog once to discipline it, a sharp, corrective blow to teach the animal a lesson. It was a version of events designed to sound like a momentary lapse in a high-stress environment. However, the reality left behind was far more disturbing. Fuzz didn't just tuck his tail and hide. He began to wither. In the hours following that discipline, the dog's health spiraled. It became clear to Janet and those nearby that something was terribly wrong. Fuzz was suffering from massive internal trauma, the kind of damage that doesn't come from a single corrective nudge. It was the result of a sustained, violent outburst, an overkill rage that left the animal broken beyond repair. Fuzz died shortly after. For the K-9 commander, the dog was a tool that had failed to follow the rules. But for Janet, the death of Fuzz was a final, chilling warning. She had seen the look in Paul's eyes during those fits of temper, and now she had seen the physical consequence of his losing control. In the logic of a domestic abuser, the dog was a rehearsal. It was a demonstration of what happens when the boundary of his will is crossed. Janet began to realize that the man she had married, the father of her children, was capable of a level of violence that left no room for survival. Friends and family would later recall how Janet's demeanor shifted after Fuzz was gone. The house felt heavier, the silence more pointed. She began to carry a weight that went beyond grief for a pet. It was the weight of a woman who realizes she is living with a monster in plain sight. Every time she walked past the empty corner where Fuzz used to sleep, she was reminded of the fragility of her own safety. It was a parent's worst nightmare to think of her children in such an environment, and that realization began to harden her resolve. The medical examiner would eventually look back at the records of that time, noting that the sheer force required to cause such internal trauma in a large, healthy German Shepherd was significant. It spoke to a loss of impulse control that was incompatible with Paul's role as a ranking officer. Why would a professional K9 handler lose control so completely with his own animal? This was the question that investigators would keep coming back to decades later. It suggested that the badge wasn't a symbol of restraint, but a mask for a man who demanded absolute submission. Janet began telling friends she was going to leave him. She was making plans, looking for a way out of the shadows of Edgewood Road. She was gathering the courage to step away from the commander and his temper, seeking a quiet life where she didn't have to watch for the next storm. She was making progress, talking about the future, and looking for a place where she and her children could be alive, safe, and grateful. But as the summer of 1982 began to fade into September, time was running out. Before she could take the first real step toward her new life, the lake began to recede, and the secrets buried in the silt were still years away from the light. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 3, where we explore the discovery at Rollins Lake and the beginning of the forensic investigation into the silt? The transition from 1982 to 1995 was not a leap, but a slow, agonizing crawl for those who loved Janet Kovacic. In the 13 years that followed her disappearance, the hills of Auburn remained quiet, and the Placer County Sheriff's Office continued its daily routines, often under the leadership of the man many suspected but could never charge. Paul Kovacic Jr. moved through his life with the stoic precision of a K9 commander, while Janet's parents, the parents who had once trusted their daughter's safety to a man of the law, lived in a perpetual state of suspended grief. They were trapped in the kind of silence that only exists when a chair remains empty at every Thanksgiving, and a daughter's voice is replaced by the hollow hum of a refrigerator in an afternoon kitchen. Nature, however, has a way of refusing to cooperate with the secrets of men. By 1995, Northern California was gripped by a punishing drought. The relentless sun beat down on the Sierra Nevada foothills, and the water levels at Rollins Lake began to drop with a rhythmic, seasonal cruelty. Rollins Lake is a place of recreation, usually filled with the sounds of splashing water and outboard motors, but as the shoreline receded, it revealed a landscape that was never meant to be seen. The receding tide left behind a vast, cracked expanse of silt and mud, a gray, alien world of sunken trees and forgotten anchors. It was during this time that a passerby, walking along the parched edge of the lake, noticed something that didn't belong among the smooth river stones and discarded fishing tackle. Embedded in the drying mud was a weathered, partial human skull. It wasn't a complete skeletal remain, but a fragment of a person, a piece of a story that had been submerged for over a decade. The lake had held its breath for 13 years, keeping Janet's secret until the earth itself forced the water to give her back. When investigators arrived at the scene, the atmosphere was one of heavy, clinical caution. They worked in the silt, their boots sinking into the muck as they recovered the fragment. At the time, the discovery sent a shock wave through the community. Everyone remembered the sergeant's wife who had vanished without a trace. Everyone looked toward the Kovacic home. But the forensic science of 1995 was a world away from what we understand today. While DNA testing was beginning to enter the public consciousness, the technology was in its infancy. The limitations of the mid-90s meant that a partial, weathered skull, damaged by years of submersion and the shifting pressure of the lake, could not provide a full genetic profile. Investigators couldn't confirm it was Janet. They couldn't even definitively rule it out. And so, the agonizing hope that had flared in the hearts of Janet's parents was met with a devastating technical stalemate. The skull was placed in an evidence locker, categorized, and tucked away on a cold metal shelf. It sat there for years, a silent witness to a crime that the system wasn't yet ready to solve. The silence returned to Auburn, heavier than before, as the case slipped back into the shadows of the unsolved files. However, even in that early stage, the medical examiner noticed something specific about the bone. There was a small, circular hole, an indentation that looked far too deliberate to be the result of a jagged rock or a boat propeller. It was a detail that would later become the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. But for now, it was just a curious mark on a piece of bone sitting in the dark. As the years passed and the skull remained unidentified, the investigation into Paul Kovacic didn't truly die. It simply waited for the science to catch up. The detectives knew that if they couldn't yet identify the woman in the lake, they had to find another way to prove the character of the man she had left behind. They realized that to understand the violence of 1982, they needed to look back at the very beginning, at the first witness to Paul's rage. They needed to look at the dog buried in the backyard, the one Janet had feared so much. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 4, where we explore the decision to exhume Fuzz and the rare forensic analysis of the forgotten witness? The calendar had turned to 2005, and the case of Janet Kovacic had been cold for so long that the frost seemed permanent. The original investigators had retired, the children were grown, and the quiet town of Auburn had moved on. But within the FBI's cold case unit, a new theory was beginning to circulate, one that didn't start with Janet, but with the creature she had loved most. They realized that in a circumstantial case where the body was missing and the suspect was a high-ranking law enforcement officer, they needed a different kind of leverage. They needed to prove not just that Paul Kovacic could have killed his wife, but that he possessed a specific, overkill propensity for violence that went far beyond the heated arguments of a failing marriage. This realization led to one of the most radical and unusual pivots in the history of California forensics. To find the truth about Janet, the FBI decided they first had to find the truth about Fuzz, the family's German shepherd who had died just weeks before Janet vanished. Paul had always maintained a simple, if cold, explanation. The dog had gotten into the trash, and in a momentary lapse of frustration, Paul had kicked him. He claimed the dog died from that single unfortunate blow, but the FBI suspected a much darker reality. They believed Fuzz hadn't been kicked. They believed he had been executed in a fit of rage so profound it served as a dark prologue to what would happen to Janet. The logic was what investigators called a forensic bridge. If they could exhume the dog's remains and find evidence of multiple fractures, blunt force trauma, or overkill injuries, it would shatter Paul's credibility. It would transform him from a grieving, albeit stern, widower into a man capable of lethal, explosive cruelty. It was a gamble. Animal remains do not always preserve well, and over 20 years had passed since Fuzz was placed in the ground. Yet, the FBI moved forward, obtaining a search warrant for the former Kovacic backyard. The scene that morning in 2005 was surreal, the kind of moment that stops a neighborhood in its tracks. Residents who had lived on the street for decades stood on their porches, coffee mugs in hand, watching as federal agents in windbreakers marked off a perimeter with yellow tape. There was a heavy, rhythmic sound that defined the morning, the metallic clink of shovels hitting the dry, packed earth of Northern California. It was slow, methodical work. They weren't looking for a person. They were looking for the bones of a dog that had been forgotten by almost everyone, except the woman who was no longer there to protect him. As the agents dug deeper, the air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and old secrets. There is a specific kind of tension that exists when law enforcement investigates one of their own. Paul Kovacic was a K-9 commander, a man whose entire professional identity was built on the bond between officer and dog. The identity paradox was glaring and uncomfortable for everyone involved. The very man who trained these animals to be heroes was now accused of being their greatest threat. When the shovel finally struck something solid with a dull, hollow thud, the digging stopped. Brushes replaced shovels. Slowly, the skeletal remains of the German Shepherd were revealed, still resting in the place where Paul had buried him 23 years earlier. Fuzz became the silent witness who, even in death, could tell the story that Janet was never allowed to finish. The bones were carefully tagged and placed into forensic containers, destined for a laboratory where experts would look for signs of a propensity for violence etched into the calcium. The community watched in a stunned silence as the remains were carried away. It felt strange, almost poetic, that the path to justice for a missing woman was being paved by the exhumation of her pet. It was a reminder that in the world of deep investigative work, no detail is too small, and no witness is truly forgotten, even if they never spoke a word in life. The agents packed their gear, the neighborhood went quiet again, and the focus shifted from the backyard to the sterile lights of the crime lab. As the FBI analyzed the bones of the German Shepherd, the laboratory in 2007 finally produced the breakthrough the Kovacic family had prayed for. The year 2007 brought a quiet, clinical kind of finality to a mystery that had hung over the Placer County hills for a quarter of a century. For 25 years, the story of Janet Kovacic had been a collection of maybes and what-ifs. Maybe she had simply walked away from her life. Maybe she had started over in a different state, leaving her children behind in a moment of overwhelmed desperation. This was the narrative Paul Kovacic Jr. had carefully curated, a story of abandonment rather than one of violence. But science has a way of stripping away the layers of a lie, and by 2007, the tools of forensic biology had finally caught up to the secrets hidden in the silt of Rollins Lake. Advanced DNA testing, a technology that was practically science fiction when Janet first vanished in 1982, was applied to the weathered skull found by a boater 12 years earlier. When the results finally came back from the lab, the abandonment myth collapsed instantly. The DNA was an undeniable match. This wasn't a nameless Jane Doe. This was Janet. But as investigators placed the skull under the harsh, sterile lights of the forensic laboratory, they realized the DNA was only the beginning of the revelation. It was the bone itself that began to speak. Upon closer inspection, forensic pathologists identified a distinct, circular hole in the cranium. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like the result of natural decay or the shifting of lakebed rocks over time. To the experts, however, it was a signature. The margins of the hole were clean, consistent with the high-velocity impact of a projectile. It was a gunshot wound. This discovery shifted the entire foundation of the case. It wasn't just a skull. It was a map of the final second of Janet's life, written in the language of ballistics. Ballistics experts were called in to measure the diameter of the entry wound with microscopic precision. Their findings were chillingly specific. The damage was consistent with a .357 Magnum, a powerful, high-caliber round. In the early 1980s, this wasn't just any weapon. It was the exact caliber of the service weapon Paul Kovacic carried as a sergeant and K-9 commander for the Placer County Sheriff's Office. The realization hit the investigative team with the weight of a physical blow. The evidence was no longer just circumstantial. It was pointing directly to a badge. Take a deep breath. We are now halfway through a 27-year journey toward justice, and the air in the room is growing heavy with the truth. For Janet's children, who were now grown adults, the news brought a different kind of trauma. For 2.5 decades, they had lived with the agonizing possibility that their mother had simply chosen to leave them. They had grown up in the shadow of that perceived rejection, perhaps wondering what they could have done differently to make her stay. Now, they were forced to trade the pain of abandonment for the horror of reality. Their mother hadn't left them by choice. She had been taken. The silence they had endured wasn't a sign of her indifference, but a result of her silence being enforced by a .357 Magnum. The forensic analysis of the skull provided a sense of overkill that matched the earlier findings from the exhumation of the family dog, Fuzz. It suggested a perpetrator who didn't just want to stop someone, but someone who acted with a definitive, violent finality. As the lab reports were finalized and the DNA profiles were filed away, the Placer County Sheriff's Office was left staring at a mountain of evidence that all led back to one of their own. The badges they wore were supposed to represent protection, but the evidence suggested that for Janet, that same badge had been a shield for a monster. With the skull identified and the dog's remains analyzed, the Placer County Sheriff's Office had to do the unthinkable: arrest one of their own. The transition from colleague to suspect was complete, and the stage was set for a trial that would shake the very foundations of the local justice system. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 6, where we cover the dramatic arrest and the badge on trial phase? The transition from the quiet investigation rooms to the sterile, high-tension atmosphere of the Placer County Superior Court was a jarring shift for a community that had lived with Janet's disappearance as a ghostly, unsolved rumor for 27 years. In early 2009, the man who once commanded the respect of the local law enforcement community, Sergeant Paul Kovacic Jr., walked into the courtroom not as an officer of the law, but as a defendant. The air in the gallery was thick with a heavy, uncomfortable silence. For many in attendance, the sight of Paul without his uniform, without his badge, and without his K9 partner was a visual representation of a fallen pillar. The trial was a collision between the man the community thought they knew and the man the evidence suggested he had become. The prosecution began laying out a narrative that was as old as time, yet intensified by the specific power dynamics of a police household. Their theory was grounded in the high-stakes reality of Paul's career. At the time, Paul was a rising star, a sergeant and K9 commander whose reputation was his greatest currency. A messy public divorce in the early 1980s wouldn't just mean the end of a marriage. It would mean the potential ruin of his professional standing and his financial security. Investigators argued that Janet had reached a breaking point, finally finding the strength to leave a man she told friends she was terrified of. To Paul, according to the state's case, Janet was no longer a partner, but a liability that needed to be managed. The prosecution suggested that he killed her to prevent a divorce that would have stripped him of his status, choosing a permanent silence over the public exposure of his private failures. As the weeks unfolded, the courtroom became a place of profound emotional conflict. One of the most difficult aspects of the trial was the testimony of Paul's former colleagues. These were men and women who had shared shift changes with him, who had trusted him in the field, and who had once looked up to his expertise as a K9 handler. To see them take the stand, forced to reconcile their professional loyalty with the grim forensic evidence, created a palpable tension. They spoke of a man who was disciplined and authoritative, but as the questioning deepened, cracks began to show in that polished exterior. The testimony touched on his temper and the way the atmosphere in the Kovacic home seemed to shift when he was present. It was a slow, agonizing process of unmasking a monster in plain sight, one witness at a time. The defense, however, leaned heavily into the ambiguity that 2 decades of silence had provided. Their argument was built on the lack of traditional smoking gun evidence. They reminded the jury that there was no full body to examine, only a partial, weathered skull recovered from the silt of Rollins Lake. There was no murder weapon recovered from the depths, no direct witnesses to the act, and no DNA trail leading back to a specific crime scene in 1982. They characterized the prosecution's case as a collection of coincidences and character assassination, arguing that the passage of time had made it impossible to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. They suggested that Janet might have simply walked away from her life, and that the skull, while tragic, didn't provide a timeline or a definitive hand that held the gun. Yet, as the evidence regarding the skull was presented, the defense's wall of ambiguity began to crumble. The jury was shown the small, circular hole in the bone, a mark consistent with a large caliber gunshot. This wasn't just any wound. It was one that matched the ballistics and power of the service weapon Paul carried every day on his hip. The systemic failure loop began to tighten around the narrative. For 25 years, Paul's status as a sergeant had potentially acted as a shield, a way to deflect suspicion and keep the investigation at a distance. But in that courtroom, the badge offered no protection. The prosecution didn't just focus on the skull. They brought back the story of Fuzz, the German shepherd whose death had preceded Janet's disappearance. By connecting the overkill tendencies Paul showed toward the animal to the eventual fate of his wife, they painted a picture of a man who used violence to maintain total control. The jury looked at the skull, and they looked at the story of Fuzz. They saw the pattern of a man who believed his position made him untouchable. And then, after days of deliberation that felt like an eternity for the families involved, they made their choice. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 7, where we discuss the reading of the verdict and the long-awaited sentence of 27 years to life? The silence in the Placer County courtroom on January 27, 2009, was a physical weight. The kind of stillness that settles over a room when decades of secrets are finally forced into the light of day. For 27 years, the question of what happened to Janet Kovacic had been a shadow over Auburn, a whisper in the hallways of the sheriff's department, and a private agony for those who loved her. But as the jury filed back into their seats, the time for whispers had ended. Paul Kovacic Jr., the man who had once commanded respect and authority as a K-9 sergeant, sat at the defense table, his posture as rigid and unyielding as the badge he used to wear. When the clerk began to read the verdict, the words, "guilty of murder in the first degree," didn't just resolve a legal case. They shattered a 27-year-old lie. Paul's reaction was something many in the gallery would later describe as chilling. There was no outburst, no slumped shoulders, and no visible sign of remorse or even shock. He remained stone-faced, his eyes fixed forward, maintaining a level of composure that felt less like strength and more like a final, defiant act of control. It was the same coldness that friends and family had seen years before, the same lack of emotion he had shown when his wife first vanished into the night. The sentence handed down was 27 years to life in state prison, a year for every single one that Janet had been missing, a poetic and heavy finality that resonated in the ears of those who had never stopped looking for her. The judge's words weren't just a punishment for a crime. They were a recognition of the decades-long void that Paul had created in so many lives. It was a parent's worst nightmare, realizing the father of their grandchildren was the same man who had taken their mother away. As the heavy metal shackles were placed on Paul's wrists, his brother-in-law, Gary, stood to speak. It was an emotional moment that brought many to tears. Even as the room remained hushed, Gary spoke about the sister he had lost, not just as a name on a police report, but as a vibrant woman who lived a quiet life, a mother who loved her children, and a person who had been living under a shadow of fear. He spoke of the 27 years he had lived in silence, the thousands of days wondering what had happened to her, and the crushing realization that the person who should have protected her was the one who had taken her life. For the prosecution, and for those who had worked on the case for decades, this was a hard-won victory. They had faced a wall of silence from many in the department, a lack of physical evidence for years, and a defense that had fought every step of the way. According to those in the courtroom, the evidence was clear. The gunshot wound to the skull, the pattern of violence that had even extended to the family dog, and the testimony of those who knew Paul's true nature. It was a hollow victory in some ways, as Janet could never be brought back. But there was a profound sense that justice had finally found its way home. Justice in this case didn't come with a shout. It came with the quiet closing of a cell door, 27 years after a mother went missing. The sound of heavy metal keys jingling and a door locking echoed in the minds of everyone there, signaling the end of Paul's life as a free man. Yet, even as he was led away, the story wasn't quite over. For many, it felt like the final chapter. But in the world of true crime, the truth has a way of being revisited. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 8, where we look at the 2026 controversy and the new questions that have begun to emerge about the evidence used to convict him? The passage of time in a prison cell is a slow, rhythmic grinding of years into decades. For Paul Kovacic, those decades have been spent within the sterile, high-security walls of the California Department of Corrections, far removed from the wooded trails of Auburn, where he once commanded respect as a top-tier K-9 officer. By March of 2026, the man who once stood tall in a sergeant's uniform has become a 76-year-old inmate, his hair thinned and his gait slowed by the inevitable march of age. But as the spring air begins to warm the hills of Placer County, a new storm is brewing, one that doesn't involve shovels in the dirt, but rather data in a server. This month marks a pivotal moment that Janet's family likely hoped would never come: Paul's first formal parole hearing. Under California law, a sentence of 27 years to life eventually reaches a point where the board must consider if the inmate still poses a threat to society. For the investigators who worked the case and the family who waited 25 years for a conviction, the thought of Paul walking free is a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, the defense has come prepared with a digital bombshell that has reignited a controversy many thought was buried along with the remains of the family dog, Fuzz. They are calling them the exhumed emails. The defense team alleges that during the 2005 investigation, the FBI suppressed internal communications that could have fundamentally altered the jury's perception of the case. These weren't just casual notes. They were supposedly high-level exchanges between forensic experts who were tasked with analyzing the bone trauma of the German Shepherd. According to these newly highlighted documents, there were voices within the Bureau who voiced significant doubt about the beaten-to-death theory that became so central to the prosecution's narrative of a man with an uncontrollable propensity for violence. Imagine a quiet office in a government facility, the soft hum of a computer fan, the only sound as a forensic specialist types out a message that contradicts the official line. These emails supposedly suggest that the fractures found on Fuzz's remains weren't necessarily the result of a sustained, murderous beating. Some experts reportedly argued that the damage was consistent with a single, albeit forceful, accidental kick, perhaps exactly what Paul had claimed back in 1982 when he said the dog had gotten into the trash. Others went even further, suggesting that given the state of the remains after 20 years in the ground, natural post-mortem decay and the pressure of the soil could not be ruled out as the cause of the bone fragmentation. This revelation creates a chilling "what if" that hangs over the entire conviction. The prosecution had used the death of the dog as a psychological roadmap. a way to show the jury that Paul was a man who could snap and kill a creature he was supposed to love and protect. If that pillar of the case is kicked away, if the dog wasn't actually murdered, the defense argues that the theory of propensity for violence begins to collapse. It suggests a narrative where a freak accident with a pet was twisted into a precursor for a homicide, creating a bias that the defense claims made a fair trial impossible. For Janet's brother and her surviving children, this feels like a secondary victimization. They have spent years healing, leaning on the closure that the 2009 verdict provided. Now, they are forced to watch as the technicalities of forensic doubt are used to potentially open the prison gates. It is a reminder that in the digital age, the secrets of the past aren't just in the ground. They are in the servers and the archives of the agencies that investigated them. The certainty of a DNA match on a skull is now being weighed against the uncertainty of a decades-old email chain. The parole board now sits in a difficult position. They must decide if a 76-year-old man, convicted on a combination of forensic science and behavioral patterns, has served enough time, or if the new evidence regarding the dog justifies a look back at the entire trial. The frustration in the courtroom is palpable. The family's grief is being reinterrogated by lawyers pointing at redacted PDF files. As the board weighs these new claims, we are forced to look at what remains of the Kovacic legacy. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 9, where we explore the lasting impact this case had on the town of Auburn and how the community finally began to heal after the shadow of the K-9 commander was lifted? Chapter 9. The Legacy of Auburn. The golden light of a California sunset has a way of softening the jagged edges of the Sierra Nevada foothills. In Auburn, when the sun dips below the tree line, the shadows of the ponderosa pines stretch long and thin across the quiet suburban streets. It is a peaceful scene, the kind that suggests a town where nothing ever goes wrong. Yet the air here carries a weight that the residents of Placer County have lived with for over 4 decades. For many years, that weight was a question mark, a missing woman, a silent house, and a powerful man who walked the halls of justice with a badge on his hip and a secret in his heart. When the conviction of Paul Kovacic Jr. finally came down in 2009, it did more than just close a case file. It punctured a hole in the localized myth of the untouchable officer. The Placer County Sheriff's Office was forced to look inward, to examine the culture that allowed a K-9 commander to cast such a long, intimidating shadow over his own home while maintaining his status as a pillar of the community. It was a painful period of reckoning. Colleagues who had once shared coffee with Paul, who had trained with his dogs, and who had perhaps looked the other way when his temper flared, had to confront the reality that a predator had been wearing their uniform. This case changed the department's approach to internal affairs and domestic incidents involving their own, serving as a grim reminder that a badge is not a shield against the darkness of the human heart. Beyond the walls of the precinct, Janet's tragedy became a catalyst for a different kind of growth. In the early 80s, the term domestic violence was often whispered, if it was spoken at all. It was seen as a private matter, a family issue to be settled behind closed doors. But as the details of Janet's fear emerged, her whispered confessions to friends, her terror after the death of the family dog, Fuzz, and her desperate plan to escape, the community began to understand the mechanics of coercive control. Janet's story helped shift the conversation in Northern California, leading to increased support for advocacy groups and a more nuanced understanding of why victims often stay until it is too late. Her life, though cut short, paved the way for others to find the exits she was denied. But perhaps the most poignant legacy of the Kovacic case is found in the lives of the children, Christopher and Kari. They grew up in a reality that feels like a psychological labyrinth. For 25 years, they lived in the shadow of a mother who had vanished and a father who maintained a stoic, albeit controlling, presence. They were children of a man who told them their mother had simply walked away, only to discover as adults that he had been the architect of her absence. Today, they move through the world with the quiet resilience of survivors. They carry the DNA of both the victim and the victimizer, navigating a life where their family history is a matter of public record and forensic study. They are the living remnants of a house that went silent too soon, and their ability to forge their own paths is perhaps the greatest victory over the trauma Paul Kovacic inflicted. In the end, it is important to remember that Janet Kovacic was more than a skull found in the silt of a receding lake. She was more than a forensic puzzle or a headline in a cold case documentary. She was a woman who loved the vibrant colors of the foothills and the simple joy of a summer morning. In the early stages of this journey, we might have imagined the hypothetical scent of lavender clinging to her clothes, but the reality was simpler and more grounded. Janet loved the smell of fresh jasmine and the sight of marigolds in the sun, flowers that represent strength and the warmth of the soul. She was the laughter in a house that was eventually hollowed out by fear, a mother whose greatest wish was to see her children grow up in safety. As the crickets begin their rhythmic chirping in the cooling evening air, the town of Auburn feels still. The water of Rollins Lake has risen and fallen many times since 1982, shifting the earth and revealing what was meant to be hidden. But the truth remains on the shore, anchored by the memory of a woman who is finally known, finally found, and finally at rest. The foothills keep their secrets for a long time, but eventually, the light finds its way through the trees. Would you like me to move on to the final closure and resolution, where we summarize the ultimate fate of Paul Kovacic and offer a final reflection on the nature of justice in the quiet corners of the world? The light in Auburn, California, has a particular quality in the late afternoon. It is a golden, honeyed hue that filters through the heavy canopy of the pines, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the foothills where Janet Kovacic once walked. For over 40 years, those shadows held a secret that many believed would never be brought into the sun. But as we look at the final chapters of this long and winding road, we find a sense of peace that only comes when the truth is no longer a matter of debate. The resolution of this case wasn't just about a gavel falling in a courtroom or a prison door swinging shut. It was about the restoration of a name and the quiet dignity of a woman who had been silenced by the very person sworn to protect her. Paul Kovacic Jr., the once formidable K-9 commander, now resides within the sterile gray walls of the California Medical Facility at Vacaville. At 76 years old, the man who once commanded respect and instilled fear through the power of his badge and the strength of his hands has become a figure defined by his confinement. The year 2026 has brought a new kind of reckoning for him. For the first time, the possibility of parole appeared on the horizon, a legal milestone that forced the community and the family he left behind to once again confront the ghost of 1982. But the weight of the evidence, the physical reality of that weathered skull, and the tragic remains of a dog named Fuzz continues to anchor him to his cell. The earth has a way of holding on to what is lost, but it also has a way of giving it back when the time is right. When those DNA results came back in 2007, they didn't just identify a person. They shattered a lie that had been carefully maintained for 25 years. Paul had spent decades suggesting that Janet had simply walked away, that she had abandoned her children and her life for reasons known only to her. It was a narrative designed to shift the blame onto the victim, to paint her as unstable or uncaring. But the skull found in the silt of Rollins Lake told a different story. The hole in the bone, consistent with a large caliber gunshot, was a silent, undeniable testimony. It spoke of a moment of violence that no amount of professional prestige could erase. It matched the service weapon he carried every day. It matched the darkness that Janet had whispered about to her closest friends in the weeks before she disappeared. As we reflect on the legacy of this case, we have to consider the role of the forgotten witness. The dog, Fuzz, whose remains were pulled from the ground decades after his death, became a symbol of the overkill and the domestic volatility that defined the Kovacic household. While the defense in 2026 continues to argue that the FBI's analysis of the dog's bone trauma was flawed, or that internal emails suggested a lack of certainty, the broader pattern remains unshaken. The exhumation of a family pet was a rare, perhaps even desperate move by investigators, but it highlighted a truth that modern forensic science is only beginning to fully embrace: that violence rarely exists in a vacuum. The way a person treats the vulnerable, whether it be a child, a spouse, or a loyal animal, is a roadmap to their character. The town of Auburn has changed since 1982. The dirt roads have been paved, the orchards have been thinned by development, and a new generation has grown up in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada. Yet, for those who remember the posters on the telephone poles and the hushed conversations in the grocery store aisles, the case of the K-9 commander remains a landmark of local history. It is a reminder that justice is not always swift, and it is rarely easy. It requires a dogged persistence, a willingness to look into the dark places, and the courage to challenge those in power. The Placer County Sheriff's Office, once Paul's kingdom, eventually became the entity that helped ensure his downfall. There was a profound, if bitter, irony in that. For Janet's children, the resolution brought a complicated kind of grief. They grew up in the absence of a mother and under the shadow of a father who was a suspect long before he was a convict. The peace of a resolved case doesn't take away the years of wondering, nor does it replace the milestones missed. But it does offer a foundation of truth. They no longer have to live in the maybe or the what if. The earth spoke, the science confirmed it, and the law eventually agreed. Janet Kovacic is no longer a missing person. She is a woman who was loved, a woman who was lost, and a woman who has finally been brought home. As the rain begins to fall tonight, steady and rhythmic against the roof, it feels like a cleansing. The foothills are quiet now. The secrets that were buried in the silt of Rollins Lake and under the soil of the old family property have been laid bare. There is a resignation in the air, a sense that the long, exhausting journey of the Kovacic family has reached its natural conclusion. Paul remains behind bars, a man whose legacy is no longer defined by his service, but by his betrayal of it. And Janet remains in the hearts of those who refused to forget her, her memory now shielded by the truth. As you drift towards sleep, let the weight of these words ground you in the safety of your own surroundings. The world is a place where mysteries exist, but it is also a place where dedicated people work tirelessly to solve them. You are safe, you are warm, and the silence of the night is a peaceful one. The stories we tell are a way of honoring the past, but they also remind us of the value of the peace we enjoy in the present. The case of the K-9 commander is a reminder that while power can hide the truth and time can bury it, the earth eventually speaks. And when it does, the silence is finally broken. Sleep well. If you are still with me, you may find the story of the Silent Woods a fitting place to go next. The link is on your screen. Good night.